fantasy short stories. Of Risk and Relativity by Lesley Herron. Chapter 6, Locomotive. Uncle Fred! Atlas's hands moved from the bars to his hips, a noise of indignation slipping past his lips. How many times have I asked you not to call me a client? I'm your nephew! The squat, imp-like lawyer just laughed.
When I'm charging you by the hour, you're a client.
Lucas frowned, his eyes moving between the man on his side of the bars, tall, pale, freckled, and still excessively naked, to the short creature outside their cell. He did this a few times, unable to find any sort of resemblance.
I thought you said your uncle's name was Bob.
Without turning to look at the dryad, Atlas shushed him with a wave of his hand. I have more than one. The ghost of a grimace crept across his face. My family is, extensive. Fred only laughed, and laughed. It was a deep, baritone chuckle for someone so small.
Kiddo, your mother is gonna be tickled pink when she finds out you're here.
I'm not here. Atlas couldn't help himself as he moved his hands back to the bars, pressing his forehead against them. As soon as I'm out of here, I'm gone.
We'll see about that.
Fred set down his briefcase and snapped his long fingers. A scroll appeared before him, unfurling a short ways before he snatched it up and read through the infernal script.
Wait a minute. Your mom.
Lucas shot the Arcanist a confused look.
You're from here?
Atlas whirled on the dryad, his one eye bulging in frustration. Now is really not the time. He gestured at the lawyer with a jerk of his head. When Lucas relented, he turned back to his uncle, who was still reading the scroll. But it was barely 6 inches long. Surely they couldn't fit that many infractions on it. Well, how bad is it? Snapping those long fingers once more, the scroll vanished, and Fred turned his attention to his favorite nephew with a smile.
Yeah, this is an easy fix. With the right defense, it'll stall in litigation for years. But I gotta ask, public nudity?
He shamed the man with several clicks of his tongue against his teeth. His face slowly fell, twisting in disgust as he finally realized, Why are you still naked? Thank you! Lucas wailed, tossing his hands up in the air as he did.
Nothing I have is long enough. All fits over his chest, and I'm so tired of tallywhacker gazing. Nah. We can't have you going before the judge like that.
Fred wiggled those long fingers, and a simple set of rose-colored clothes appeared on his nephew's body.
That, and I'm not too keen on subjecting myself to it either.
Atlas lifted the lapel of his robe, bringing it to his nose with a sniff. He scrunched his face as the smell of stale mothballs and foul musk hit him hard. Do you have anything cleaner and not pink? Before Lucas could even argue that the color of the robes wasn't the least bit important right now, as long as they covered his shame, what did it matter? Fred clicked shut his briefcase, and the walls and bars of their cell slammed down into the ground. He scratched behind his horn as he and the robot followed the Arcanist out. There was no time for curiosities, however, as the lawyer gathered his things and took off. They had to jog, or hobble in Atlas's case, in order to keep up. They passed dozens of doors that each sat beneath heavy signs denoting them as various rehabilitation rooms. Each one was terrifying enough to quicken Lucas's pace. Some were thick, reinforced metal with bolts the size of his palm. Others were narrow and covered in crushed velvet. A few of them even had tiny viewing windows. The occupants of those rooms had their faces pressed against the glass, their eyes distant and haunted. One door stood ajar. Screams of anguish and agony could be heard from within.
Looks like Judge Kregma will be overseeing your case. Normally she's not very forgiving, but she owes me a favor.
Fred came to a stop, waiting for a long line of clerical workers to pass them, and he turned to his nephew.
And so will you after this.
Atlas rolled his one eye.
Fine. Get us out of here, and I'll owe you whatever you want.
Wait, us?
Fred glanced at the odd pair coming up behind his client.
You want me to represent all three of you?
He lowered his voice.
It'd be easier if it was just you, kiddo.
Atlas glanced over at the two others. While he hadn't considered leaving them here, he could make an argument for not being associated with them. He knew nothing of the Dryad or the metal machine, and ditching them might get him back to Barry faster. But as Lucas pulled to a stop beside him, his face was pale, eyes wide, and his gaze locked on the nearest door labeled Room of Eternal Flame, Atlas relented, groaning as he pinched the bridge of his nose.
No, we're in this together.
Fine. Group fee it is.
Shaking his own head, Fred snapped his fingers once more, producing 2 short scrolls.
But you're gonna owe me so many favors.
The trouble with having a lawyer for an uncle was that Atlas was more likely to prematurely meet the heavenly bodies of the realms of desire than he was to renege on all these favors.
Let's see here. The Dryad is being brought up on charges of conspiracy to commit public indecency, and the tin can over there is in for, 87 counts of littering. What did you do, blow up a dumpster?
He shook his head.
Anyway, this is gonna be a bit tricky, but I'm pretty sure I can get it reduced to something more manageable.
Lucas opened his mouth, ready to protest his innocence in the entire nudity fiasco, when screams erupted into the hall. This time not from behind a torture room door. A pair of battered imp guards fled in their direction, their hands flailing in the air as they cried, "Run! She too strong!" Before either the Dryad or the Arcanist could react, chaos detonated around them like a poorly timed confetti bomb. A siren wailed to life overhead, silencing the continued shouts from the other guards, and an explosion rattled the ground beneath their feet, causing 2 massive stone gargoyles to emerge from a room behind them. The pair charged towards the commotion, the tips of their granite wings scraping against the ceiling. When a large fissure crackled down the wall in their direction, spraying Atlas with bits of gypsum and spackle, he hobbled back a step.
Uncle Fred, is there another path we could take?
The lawyer only shook his head with a bark of laughter.
This? Nah, this is just a typical Wednesday. We'll be fine.
He began walking towards the commotion, swinging his briefcase and whistling a jaunty tune as he did.
Wait, you don't understand. This woman, she's...
Atlas's fingers clenched at the air as his uncle rounded the corner. His lips tightened into a line as he looked back over at the Dryad and the robot.
Come on, we have to rescue him.
Okay. Lucas started after the Arcanist, his mind wandering to, who's gonna rescue us? When he all but slammed into Atlas's back. He looked up, rubbing at his nose, in time to see one of the stone gargoyles crash into a nearby door, collapsing it inward. A huge, slimy tentacle whipped out of the rehabilitation room and wrapped around the dazed guard, hauling it inside. The dust in the hall cleared, and the battered wings of the other gargoyle came into view. There was a horrible, hollow, cracking sound, and the guard shattered into rubble. Standing over the remains, dressed in glossy red armor, was a woman. Atlas shoved his sleeves up over his elbows, ready to summon a fireball, or whatever it would be, and froze. He didn't need to see her face to recognize those horns.
Undine?
Eric let out an exhausted grunt as he lowered himself down on a cold, lonely bench that sat on a frozen concrete platform, overlooking an icy mountain range and a set of frost-covered train tracks. If it weren't for the pain radiating up from his feet, He might have been more excited to see that there was, indeed, a working train in the far reaches of a fantasy-riddled land. His gaze shifted from the fresh batch of snow clouds rolling in over the horizon down to his fingers, still attached despite Grammy's attempts to saw them off while he was awake. She insisted they were getting worse. He insisted she was insane. But as he stared at them, he could tell she was right, and the black skin had moved further up his palm. The glitter of stardust had gone, but the memory of Kadayane's words were still fresh in his mind. He would be much more enthusiastic about the train and all the technology of this land if he hadn't been sent on a quest. That word was a bitter pill he'd do anything not to swallow. He had tasted power. Real power. And now he was just supposed to shove that away for what? Lessons? He pulled himself from his mental spiral when he heard the clacking of dog nails on the platform behind him. Eric turned to see Indiga, riding on the back of Duck, was approaching him with that patented, good-natured smile plastered on his face. He huffed to see that it wasn't just one Selkie joining him on the lonely, ice-covered platform, but the entire family. Indiga's mom, dad, and 7 siblings had made the venture, and Grammy. It wasn't until Indiga slid off Duck's back and landed on the hard metal bench beside him that Eric found the words he'd been searching for. "What are you doing here? I really don't need a send-off party." "Oh, they're not here for you," Indiga laughed. "They're here for me." Eric scratched behind his ear, a frown tugging at his brow. "Where are you going?" "It's not every day that someone I know is sent on an epic quest." Indiga's smile continued as his family began piling around him. "And I can't pass up the opportunity to visit the other countries. I've lived in these snow-touched hills my whole life, seeing only the ice flows of the ocean and the frozen mountains of Athia. It would be nice to learn what else is out there." "I appreciate your excitement, but—" Eric hesitated. He had just forced the word quest from his mind when it so rudely shoved its way back into his thoughts. He was already on a very important quest and certainly had no time to start another one. Time. That could be the key to everything. He had done it once. If he could do it again, he could go back and set everything right. He just needed to escape this inane task. "I'm also here," Indiga cut in, reading the thoughts on the elf's face as plainly as if they were written there, "to make sure you don't take any shortcuts. If Kadayane asked you to do something, then I'm here to make sure you do it. You're still my responsibility. And trust me, you're gonna need a friend." At the mention of the goddess, Indiga's youngest brothers and sisters piled in.
What did Kadayane look like? Was she nice? Did you make a wish? Does she grant wishes?
Eric recoiled from the sudden onslaught of children swarming him. He put his blackened hands up, hoping to fend them off. "No, a whale? A woman? I don't know how to describe what she looked like. No, she was not very nice, and I don't think she grants wishes." Over the sound of a flurry of more questions, whines from Duck, and the worried chatter of parents over their disabled son, Eric heard something that made his chest swell with relief. The bellow of a massive horn sent chills down his spine, signaling the train's approach. He could see the black plume of smoke from a coal-burning engine as the seat began to vibrate beneath him. The closer it got, the louder the sound of the crank against the drivers became. But despite his trepidation, and most of all his irritation, Eric couldn't fight back that giddy feeling welling up inside him. That spark of excitement all scientists feel when they experience something new or something unexpectedly familiar in a place they didn't expect. He climbed unsteadily to his feet, eager to watch the full approach of such a feat of engineering found in a time-lost world. The mechanical monster, consisting of one engine, the coal bunker, and a few passenger cars, pulled into the station with a sharp squeal of its brakes. A loud hiss signaled the train had come to a full stop, and a man hopped down from the engine, moving from car to car. He opened the doors and held out his hand to help any and all passengers that exited the vehicle. Indiga straightened up. "Well, Mom, Dad," he shifted his gaze around to his parents. "Looks like our ride is here."
"Be careful, dear."
Sagani handed her son a carefully wrapped package before her husband pulled him into a hug.
"And let us know how you're doing the moment you can."
Eric turned away from the family display. His heart was still raw from seeing his own. He felt the sting of jealousy creeping into his awareness whenever he glanced their way. Instead, he focused on the people leaving and boarding the train, most of them sulky merchants or fishermen. His eyes followed one until he noticed Grammy was standing right beside him. With a startled yelp, he jumped back, losing his footing on the slick concrete. He landed painfully on his rump. He groaned, staring up at the gray sky as the ache ebbed away. "What the hell, lady?" Grammy only cackled and pulled something from the depths of her parka.
"You'll need this for your journey."
He looked over at what she was handing him. It was a simple, unassuming, leather-bound journal. Eric reached out and flipped it over, inspecting several pages. They were all blank, before turning his curiosity on the old sulky. "What is this for?"
"If you want to keep those,"
Grammy pointed at his blackened hands,
"you'll need to use them. Practice every day."
One of Indiga's brothers helped Eric to his feet, and after nodding his thanks to the man, he shoved the journal into his newly acquired satchel. It was a gift given to him by Sagani the night before, when they'd all dined on fish and cabbage stew, and he recounted his time spent with their goddess. When the conductor began shouting for last boarding, Eric turned back to the tiny woman and offered her a half-hearted grin. "Thanks for, well, everything." Logically, he knew it wasn't her fault he had lost his toes, despite how much he wanted to blame her. Grammy only smiled her three-toothed smile at him as she pulled something else from her coat.
"A souvenir."
Eric took the small bottle from her and held it up to his face and squinted. He was still very much blind without his glasses, but he could see that inside the plastic container was a round ball of lead, coated in blood. His blood. Grammy must have dug out the bullet from where Varen had shot him almost a month ago. Given everything that had happened to him, he had completely forgotten about it. There were other, more painful things to focus on. His grin turned into a grimace. "Thanks?" "Hey, Your Majesty, the train's about to leave. If we miss this one, the next one won't be back around for another week." Indiga had climbed onto Duck's back, who was in the process of jumping onto the first passenger car. Eric shifted the weight of the bag on his shoulder and hobbled towards the conductor. The single crutch gifted to him to support his walking was already digging into his arm. How long did an epic quest like this usually take? Time was something he never had enough of. Perhaps, with the right understanding, he could get all that he would ever need. Well, at least he had a fresh journal to work in. Within the walls of the prison, and also the adjoining courtroom, the legal system here was incredibly efficient. Time moved differently, Lucas noticed. Their lawyer had led them through the maze of doors and left them standing outside a clerical office for what could have been minutes or maybe hours. He couldn't be sure, but he passed the seconds by staring at their party's newest member. The woman was dressed in red and black armor, decorated with a large, stylized willow tree on the breastplate. She had dark skin patterned with wood grain, and 2 horns poking from her shoulder-length white hair. Horns. like his. He had never seen someone else like him, save for his mother, but his memories of her were faint. And he had so many questions. Lucas had begged the Arcanist to ask another favor of his uncle and let her join them. In the end, it hadn't been too hard to sell. He was pretty sure the pink-robed magician had a bit of a thing for her. Atlas pushed his hands behind his head as he leaned back against the wall. He shot a glance over at the warrior dryad, that playful smile lurking on his face.
So, how did you end up in the infernal realm?
Undine sniffed in response, turning a haughty glare in his direction, and she replied with a shrug, "I don't know." It wasn't a lie, or an omission of truth, but fact. She had been traversing through Irinian's root door, enjoying the reprieve from watchful eyes, when something tore the tunnel apart around her, and then she was plummeting through the sky. What they didn't need to know was that she then crashed through several branches of a tree in a manicured lawn, landing on a stuffed paper animal that had been filled with treats. Undine cringed as she tried to spare herself the memory of what happened after that. Let's just say it involved angry parents, crying children, candy flying everywhere, and no less than 20 police imps. Sure that there was more to that story, Atlas gave her an "uh-huh" look with a knowing lift of his eyebrow. He enjoyed pushing her buttons, and grinned as he lowered his hands.
So then, where were you headed? If you landed here, surely you were traveling through a portal.
Undine clicked her tongue against her teeth and looked away.
It isn't important. I'll say it isn't.
A door behind them flew open, and Fred the lawyer stomped out, holding a very crinkled roll of parchment. His joyful demeanor had all but evaporated as he glared up at the armored dryad.
Do you have any idea just how many chits I had to call in to smooth over the damage you caused?
He shook the papers up at her.
Attempted murder?
I did not attempt to harm anyone. That child should have moved once he saw the fighting. Undine folded her arms across her chest.
You're lucky I was able to get the police chief to drop the charges down to battery and reckless endangerment of a birthday party.
Fred whirled around on his nephew, but he was so furious he couldn't articulate. The only words that fell from his mouth were infernal. Atlas wilted under the assault.
Okay, I get it.
He moved his hands out in front of him.
Favors, yes. Can you get us out of here?
You better hope I can.
Fred tossed the scroll into the air, and with a snap of his fingers, it disappeared.
Come on, I heard Judge Kregma's in a foul mood.
He shot a glare at Undine.
I wonder why.
Lucas followed numbly behind them, his mind turning over every possible negative outcome. He wasn't sure how long he had been spiraling, but the entire party came to a stop. Time had once again behaved irrationally. That or the halls had moved on him. Either was just as likely. And now they were already standing before what he could only assume was the judge's chambers. He shrugged to himself. Had to be magic. Where the ceiling had been low enough he could reach up and touch it before, they were now standing in front of a door that stretched some 20 feet high, the tip of the arch disappearing into thick, black magic. Its surface was richly decorated with tales of glorious battles by heroic imps. Fred, still grumbling with rage, rapped the back of his knuckles on it. He looked over at his nephew.
I called your mother.
He let the threat hang heavy in the air, then turned his gaze on the towering machine lurking behind the others.
Oi, robot, you have to stay out here. We're entering a clean room.
Unit 2, still unable to speak, gave a firm salute. As the door began to open, the noise of the hinges rumbling like a hungry animal, Undine glanced at the other dryad. It had been over 50 years since she had last laid her eyes on a male dryad. But this one, with his mop of disheveled blonde hair and freckled brown skin, was only half. He glanced over his shoulder at her, and her breath caught at the sight of a familiar set of amber-colored eyes. His resemblance to Queen Pyra was uncanny. Undine scrutinized him as their party trudged inside, her mind running over something Vel had said. What had he called it? Parallel variance? She caught sight of a familiar golden earring and nodded to herself. That explained some of the cranky cyborg's actions. Stepping over the threshold, Undine's attention was pulled to the so-called clean room. It looked nothing like what she had expected, and instead resembled a place of worship more than a courtroom. She had seen the temples of the Yara, with their wooden pews and elegant stone effigies. But here the benches were adorned with grotesque figureheads on either end, and stone columns that had been carved into paned figures made to look like they held up the impossibly high ceiling. And where the effigy should be was a woman, although she could have been a badger for as agitated as she looked, with large round ears and an impressive beard.
Judge Kriegma! Oh, you're looking absolutely radiant today.
Fred set down his suitcase and licked the tips of his fingers, smoothing down all that remained of his gray, wispy hair.
As always. Have you done something new with your beard?
Lucas was just about to lower himself into one of the benches when the door behind them slammed shut, followed by the click of a latch. He frowned as he began to hear crackling static, like a badly tuned radio rising in volume. Following the tone was pain unlike anything he had experienced before, and it ripped through his skull, buckling him to his knees. He cried out, reaching up into his hair where his fingers scrabbled at something behind his horns. He wrenched free the pair of devices attached to his skull, and the world fell silent, the agony slowly fading to a pounding throb. It was several moments before Lucas became aware that Atlas was gripping his shoulder, shouting at him. Through teary eyes, he barely managed to read the Arcanist's lips.
Hey, what's wrong? What's happening?
And then Uncle Fred was waving his hands, his irritated mood back on full display as he shouted at Lucas, even though he couldn't hear a word he was saying. Confused and worried they might be fussing over his well-being, he held up his hands in a gesture that he hoped conveyed he was fine. Clearly satisfied with that response, the lawyer returned to his negotiations, calling the Arcanist away to join him. Lucas attempted to push himself to his feet. He had never had a high pain tolerance, and the splitting ache in his head was threatening to empty the contents of his already empty stomach. A strong hand reached down and hoisted him to his feet, where he wobbled unsteadily for a moment. The sudden shift from hearing to deaf gave him vertigo. Lucas looked up to see the other dryad. The warrior woman had helped him up and offered her a small smile and mouthed the words, "Thank you." She replied by asking him if he was okay, and he nodded. Apart from the agony roiling through him, this was nothing new. When he was 7, he had been diagnosed with a form of degenerative hearing. His father had flown them halfway across the world to seek out the best doctors in their fields in a vain attempt to keep him from going deaf. By his 9th birthday, however, he had lost 99% of his hearing. But as technology advanced, so too did his opportunities to regain what he had once lost. 3 years later, he had 2 wonderful cochlear implants and was normalizing to the sounds he missed most in the world. His father humming over the morning cuppa, the frogs down by the creek near their house, Saturday morning cartoons, even if it had taken him a solid year to adjust to the way sounds were translated through the devices. Her curiosity piqued. Undine ignored her manners and reached out to inspect the spot behind the man's horns where the devices had sat, only for the glint of his earring to catch her eye. Now that she could see it up close, the fragile rectangle of gold hanging from Lucas's ear was stamped with the familiar symbol that soured her stomach. She released him with a click of her tongue against her teeth and left the dryad to stand on his own. Quickly grabbing one of the benches for support, Lucas glanced at the woman, unsure what that was all about. His own fingers moved to his earring, but his attention was pulled to the odd courtship display unfolding at the podium. Lawyer Fred was wearing his best googly eyes at the judge, who was lapping up the attention, and then apparently said the wrong thing. Judge Craigma reached back with a stout hand and slapped the impish man across the face. She then slammed her gavel down, barely missing his hand as he jerked it back. And in the next breath, the judge's chair whirled around, and when it spun back to face them, it was empty. The door behind them clicked open, and a guard appeared, ushering in the robot.
Unbelievable!
Atlas shook his head as he and his uncle approached the two dryads.
I cannot believe you told her that her beard would look better in braids.
He stepped in front of Lucas and tapped the man on the shoulder, giving him a hearty thumbs up.
Never tell a woman how to wear her hair. It's like we're not even related.
Not sure if the gesture meant he could put his implants back in, or if that meant everything was settled, Lucas took a chance and began reattaching his hearing aids. Sounds came in waves of crackling distortion, a side effect of the magic dampening room, he suspected. As they began to clear, he landed in the middle of Fred speaking to him personally.
Next time I say we're going into a clean room, next time, don't bring any electronics. There's too many anti-espionage spells in here. You could have exploded.
Fred sighed heavily and slammed his briefcase down on the nearby table. He clambered up onto the chair and clicked it open, pulling out a blank sheet of paper. He snapped his fingers, and a brown quill appeared above it.
Thankfully, your little episode earned us some sympathy with Craigma.
He looked around at all of them.
I wasn't able to walk back any of your charges, mostly because of her.
He pointed his finger up at the warrior dryad.
And since you all agreed to be in this together, you get to work off your debts together.
Lucas watched, his mouth hung open in amazement, as the quill was inscribing something down as the lawyer spoke. It wasn't copying his words, but creating its own. He leaned over to see the header, Terms and Agreements. Magic. He laughed nervously.
And that means...
Atlas's hand waved in an inviting gesture, hoping his uncle would finish his thoughts a little faster.
Community service.
Oh!
Atlas wailed, his head leaning back pathetically.
That's code for indentured servitude. I don't have time for that. I'll have you know,
It's freelance work at the Grand Echo Resort and Spa, or the 43 years in prison they were asking for originally.
Fred leaned over, not bothering to pay attention to his nephew's continued belly aching, to scan the contents of the scroll. A smile curled his features when there were no further arguments. He pulled up the paper and turned to the group.
I'll take it you all rather do a little customer service instead.
Again, no complaints.
Good.
Fred hopped down from his chair.
You'll all need to sign this contract, and then it's straight to work.
He narrowed his eyes at the Arcanist.
This is a legal and binding contract, so no nicknames, pseudonyms, or aliases.
Now. Lucas licked his lips as a lump settled into his throat. Fred handed the quill to his nephew, who signed his name, Atlas O'Rourke, before passing it off to the other dryad. She scribbled out only the word Ondine and offered it to the robot, whose signature resembled text printed off an old dot matrix machine. Unit number 2. And then it was his turn. He sucked in a deep breath for courage and pushed the nib into the paper. He wrote Lucas Devore on the line. He was about to hand over the quill when his name burst into flames. He jumped back with a surprised shout and looked from the scroll to the lawyer and then back. The line for his name was empty now, his previous signature burned away.
Hey, I said legal names only!
Mixed emotions were running through him, mostly anger and shame. But Lucas pushed the end of the quill to the line once more, and, as quickly as he could, scrawled his full name. He tried to hide it with the feather portion of the quill and shoved the paper towards the lawyer. But Atlas was much too fast for that. He batted the pen away and snatched the document up, reading each name. A giant, opened-mouthed smile spread across his face as he looked up at the dryad.
Your real name is Poppy?
I don't want to talk about it,
Lucas grumbled. After several attempts to ignore the Arcanist, however, he relented with a petulant whimper.
Oh, my mom named me. And, if you believe me dad, she swore up and down I would be a girl.
His shoulders slumped.
I guess male dryads really are rare. Anyway, Dad used to tell me that he tried to reason with her, that Poppy was no name for a boy, but she wouldn't budge. So he gave me the middle name Lucas, and that's what I go by.
Atlas roared with laughter. His hands clamped around his stomach as he struggled to get out his words.
If you tell anyone...
Lucas reached out and grabbed the Arcanist by his robes and pulled him in close, silencing his amusement.
I will murder you and bury you beneath a plant so deep no one will ever find your body. That's enough joking around,
Fred cut in, taking the parchment and the quill. He scanned over the scroll and snapped his fingers. It and the pen disappeared in a puff of smoke.
You're all settled. Enjoy your stay at the Infernal Realm's #1 staycation resort.
He jumped back up on the chair and closed his briefcase.
Don't call me if you get in any trouble.
He whirled around, leveling a finger on his nephew.
I won't help you out.
His eyes moved around the party of 4 before he clapped his hands in finality. And just like that, their surroundings abandoned them in a rush. The walls and ceiling retracted into the ground, pews and pillars twisted away into nothing, and the lawyer exploded into a cloud of sparkles and colorful smoke. They were left standing on a busy sidewalk, staring up at a monstrously gray building. It was just as plain and unassuming as it was austere and sharp, an architectural feat of neo-Gothic brutalism, like a corporate monolith rising into the dark sky. Unlike the rest of the city they had left behind, this structure was human-sized, larger even. 2 well-dressed ogres stood outside the single set of glass-arched doors. One wore a toothless grin, while the other begrudgingly reached for the handle and extended a warm invitation with a sweep of his hand. Atlas sighed through tight lips. Hopefully they could finish this up quick. There was no telling what trouble Barry could be up to at this very moment. He looked back at the others.
Well, come on, Poppy. We've got customers to service.
You've been listening to Of Risk and Relativity by Lesley Herron, Book 5 in the series here on Tall Tale TV. If you would like to listen to the entire book in one place, or any of her other novels, you can find them at talltaletv.com/series, or by following the links in the description.
What that, Gussie? Timmy ain't well. And that not all. Call now and we include 2, you heard me, 2 salad chopper for price of 1. Have you ever accidentally committed grand larceny? Have you ever walked into a bank and had your fictional short story mistaken for a robbery note? It happens to us all. Hi, I'm Fred Lawyer, and I'm here to help you out of a jam.
I unintentionally got in wrong car and drove it to Chop Shop 9 times. But Fred Lawyer convinced the police that it was all misunderstanding because me colorblind. Thanks, Fred Lawyer.
That's right. I've helped people beat charges big and small and for rock-bottom rates. So if you've been caught in the act, remember to call Fred Lawyer, the lawyer you can trust. Call 555-INNOCENT. That's 555-466-6236. Bah, never anything good on anymore.